The coffee mug slipped from Marcus Thompson's weathered hands, dark liquid steaming against the pristine Montana snow as the sound froze his 65-year-old bones. It wasn't the wind howling through the pines at 15 below zero. It was something else entirely, something that made the hair on his neck rise like a wolf sensing danger. The cry came again, cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through silence, and Marcus recognized it instantly. Not the territorial roar of a predator or the warning bark of startled wildlife. This was the sound of a mother in agony, desperate and raw, echoing off the canyon walls with a grief that transcended species. His radio crackled to life, dispatch calling all units, but Marcus was already moving toward the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Behind him, steam rose from spilled coffee melting into snow, marking the exact moment when routine patrol became something else entirely. What waited in those woods would test everything he believed about duty, friendship, and the bonds that connect all living things. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Marcus Thompson had learned to read the wilderness like scripture during his 43 years in these mountains, first as a coal miner in the depths below, then as a park ranger walking the ridges above. At 65, his body carried the weight of both worlds, lungs scarred from coal dust, knees that creaked like old floorboards, but eyes that could spot a deer track in yesterday's snow from 50 yards away. The kind of eyes that came from a lifetime of looking for signs that something was wrong. He'd started this morning patrol thinking about retirement benefits and whether his small pension would stretch through another Montana winter. The part-time ranger job barely covered his mortgage on the modest cabin where he'd lived alone for the past 3 years, ever since Martha's heart finally gave out from the weight of their shared grief. She'd never gotten over losing Danny in that mine collapse 10 years ago, and if Marcus was honest with himself, neither had he. The coffee had been a luxury. Real Colombian beans Sarah Mitchell had brought him from her last supply run to Kalispell. Sarah, the retired veterinarian who volunteered at the wildlife sanctuary, had been making excuses to stop by his cabin more often lately. At 58, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent 30 years calming frightened animals, and her gray-streaked auburn hair caught the morning light in a way that made Marcus forget, sometimes, that he was supposed to be getting old. These mountains held memories in every shadow. The clearing where he'd taught Danny to track elk. The ridge where Martha used to sit and sketch wildflowers. The old mining road where everything changed that October morning when the ground swallowed his boy whole. Marcus had transferred to the surface after that, trading his headlamp for a ranger's badge, trading the darkness underground for the endless sky above. But it was in these same mountains, on a spring morning 8 years ago, that he'd found the orphaned bear cub caught in an illegal snare, half dead and whimpering, no bigger than a house cat, with a distinctive cross-shaped scar forming where the wire had cut into her front paw. He'd bent every regulation in the book to get her to Sarah's clinic, then personally relocated her to the deep wilderness where she'd have the best chance of survival. The sound cutting through the morning air now carried the same desperate quality as that long-ago whimpering, but magnified tenfold. It was the kind of sound that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the heart, the universal language of a parent losing a child. Marcus had heard it once before, in his own voice, echoing off hospital walls the day they told him Danny was gone. Marcus followed the sound through snow that crunched like broken glass beneath his boots, each step taking him deeper into the kind of wilderness that swallowed cell phone signals and humbled city folks who thought GPS could replace instinct. The temperature gauge on his belt read -18 and dropping, the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground and made every breath feel like swallowing razors. The crying grew louder as he crested a small ridge, and there, in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines heavy with snow, Marcus saw something that made his heart slam against his ribs like a caged bird. A massive brown bear, easily 400 pounds, was circling a crude pit that had been carved into the frozen earth. But this wasn't the methodical pacing of a predator. This was the desperate dance of a mother in agony. The bear's dark coat was matted with ice crystals, and as she moved, Marcus caught sight of something that stopped him cold. A cross-shaped scar on her front right paw, faded but unmistakable. Bella, the orphaned cub he'd saved 8 years ago, had grown into this magnificent creature, and now she was experiencing every parent's worst nightmare. In the pit below, barely visible in the shadows, a small form lay motionless against the earthen walls. A cub, no more than 6 months old, had fallen into what Marcus immediately recognized as a hunting trap, one of the illegal snares that poachers dug and concealed with branches and snow. The pit was roughly 8 feet deep and 4 feet across, its walls too smooth and steep for even an adult bear to climb out, let alone a frightened baby. Bella lifted her massive head toward the gray sky and released another cry that seemed to shake snow from the surrounding branches. It was a sound that transcended species, the universal language of helplessness that every parent understood. Marcus had made that same sound 10 years ago in a hospital corridor, watching doctors shake their heads and cover his son with a white sheet. The cub stirred weakly, lifting its small head just enough to emit a pitiful whimper that sent Bella into another frenzied circle around the pit's edge. Marcus pulled out his binoculars and focused on the trapped animal, his ranger training taking over even as his heart broke. The cub was showing early signs of hypothermia, sluggish movements, labored breathing, the telltale shivering that indicated its body was losing the battle against the killing cold. At this temperature, with no shelter and no way to generate body heat, the cub had perhaps 2 hours before its core temperature dropped to the point of no return. Maybe less. Marcus had seen enough hypothermia cases during his mining days to know the brutal mathematics of survival. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. He studied the pit more carefully, noting the fresh tool marks on the walls where someone had deliberately smoothed and steepened the sides. This wasn't an accident or a natural formation. Someone had engineered this trap with the specific intention of capturing bears, probably for their gallbladders and paws, which fetched obscene prices on the black market, the kind of money that made desperate men do evil things. Bella seemed to sense his presence and turned those intelligent brown eyes toward him. For a moment, bear and man stared at each other across the span of 8 years and 2 species, and Marcus swore he saw recognition flash in her gaze. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her body language shifting from pure maternal panic to something more complex. Hope mixed with wariness, desperation tempered by an almost human understanding that this particular human had helped her before. Marcus reached for his radio, but his hand froze halfway to his belt. Protocol was clear. No interference with wildlife under any circumstances. Report the situation to Fish and Wildlife, establish a perimeter, and let nature take its course. The kind of by-the-book response that would take hours to implement, and would almost certainly result in the cub's death. His job, his pension, his entire future hung on following those regulations. But as Bella released another heartbroken cry, and the cub's whimpering grew weaker, Marcus heard another voice, Danny's voice, clear as if his son were standing right beside him in the snow. "Dad, we gotta help. You can't just watch something die when you know how to save it." His fingers found his phone instead of the radio, and he scrolled to a number he'd memorized but rarely called. Sarah Mitchell answered on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise. "Marcus? What's wrong?" "I need you to get out to Grizzly Creek Canyon fast as you can," he said, his breath forming white clouds that obscured his vision. Bring your veterinary kit and anything you've got for hypothermia. And Sarah, this conversation never happened. The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if he'd lost the signal. Then Sarah's voice came back, steady and sure. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Marcus spent the next 15 minutes doing something that went against every regulation in the Park Service manual. He began preparing for an unauthorized wildlife rescue. From his pack, he pulled out the climbing rope he always carried for emergency situations, testing each strand for weakness in the brutal cold. The nylon was stiff as cable, but it would hold. It had to. Bella watched his every movement with an intensity that unnerved him. She'd stopped her frantic circling and now sat on her haunches near the pit's edge, her massive head swiveling between Marcus and her trapped cub. When he approached within 10 feet of the hole, she huffed a warning but didn't charge. It was as if some part of her understood that this human represented her baby's only chance. The cub's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see the small creature had stopped shivering, a bad sign that meant its body was no longer generating enough heat to trigger the reflex. Its breathing had become shallow and irregular, and it lay curled in a tight ball against the pit's wall, seeking warmth that didn't exist. A distant rumble made Marcus freeze. Engines. Multiple snowmobiles approaching from the east, maybe 2 miles out, but getting closer. In this wilderness, that could only mean one thing. The people who'd dug this trap were returning to check their snare. His radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for him to catch fragments of conversation on an unfamiliar frequency. Professional hunters used encrypted channels, but sometimes the signals bled through. Check trap 7. Snow covered the markers. Fresh tracks leading away from the pit. Somebody's been here. Marcus's blood turned colder than the Montana air. These weren't amateur poachers looking to make a quick buck. The coordinated approach, the numbered trap system, the professional equipment. This was an organized operation, and they were coming back to collect their prize. The sound of Sarah's pickup truck grinding through the snow came as both relief and terror. She was driving faster than safe conditions allowed, her old Ford fishtailing on the icy logging road that led to the canyon. Marcus could hear her engine straining against the steep grade, pushing her vehicle beyond its limits because she understood that minutes mattered. She emerged from the truck wearing her full veterinary winter gear, insulated coveralls, heated gloves, and carrying the emergency medical kit she'd assembled over 3 decades of treating animals in crisis. Her gray, streaked hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face carried the focused intensity Marcus had seen whenever she worked on a difficult case. "Jesus, Marcus," she breathed, taking in the scene. Her trained eye immediately assessed the cub's condition from above. Severe hypothermia, probably approaching second stage. "We need to get that baby warmed up in the next 30 minutes or we're going to lose it." Bella's reaction to Sarah's arrival was remarkably calm. The bear studied the new human for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. She moved aside, creating space for both humans to work near the pit. It was behavior that defied everything Marcus knew about protective mother bears, but somehow it felt completely natural. "The engine sounds are getting closer," Marcus warned, beginning to secure his rope around the largest pine tree. "We've got company coming, and they're not the friendly type." Sarah nodded grimly, already unpacking thermal blankets and chemical heat packs from her kit. "Then we work fast. You get down there and stabilize the cub while I prepare a warming protocol up here." "And Marcus?" She caught his eye, her expression fierce. "I don't care what the regulations say. I didn't spend 30 years learning to save lives just to watch a baby die because of some bureaucratic nonsense." The descent into the pit was harder than Marcus had anticipated. At 65, his joints protested every movement, and the frozen rope bit through his insulated gloves like wire. Halfway down, he heard Bella move closer to the edge, her massive form blocking out the weak sunlight above. Instead of feeling trapped, Marcus felt protected, as if the mother bear was standing guard while he tended to her child. The cub was barely conscious when Marcus reached the bottom of the pit. Its small body felt limp and cold even through his gloves, and its breathing was so shallow he had to lean close to detect any movement at all. Gently, he wrapped the tiny creature in the thermal emergency blanket Sarah had lowered down, then activated 2 chemical heat packs and placed them against the cub's core. "How is it?" Sarah called down, her voice tight with professional concern. "Alive, but not by much," Marcus replied, cradling the cub against his chest. "Body temperature's way too low. We need to get it up top for proper treatment." The pulley system they rigged was crude but effective. Sarah had brought a compact winch from her truck, the same equipment she used to lift large animals onto her examination table. As Marcus secured the cub in an improvised harness, he felt the small creature stir against his chest, a tiny whimper, barely audible, but it was the first sign of real life the cub had shown since he'd arrived. The engines were close now, maybe a quarter-mile out. Marcus could distinguish individual machines, at least 3 snowmobiles moving in formation. Professional hunters who knew these trails and weren't concerned about making noise because they assumed they owned this piece of wilderness. As the makeshift elevator lifted the cub toward safety, Marcus watched Bella's reaction. The massive bear moved to the edge of the pit, her nose twitching as she caught her baby's scent rising toward her. When the cub reached the surface, Sarah immediately began working her medical magic, but Bella's behavior was what took Marcus's breath away. The mother bear lay down beside Sarah, creating a windbreak with her massive body while the veterinarian worked. She watched every movement with intense focus, but never interfered, as if she understood that these humans possessed knowledge she needed for her cub's survival. The rumble of engines grew louder, and Marcus realized they were out of time. The snowmobiles crested the ridge just as Sarah finished wrapping the cub in a combination of thermal blankets and activated heat packs. 3 machines moving in tight formation, their riders dressed in professional winter camouflage that marked them as anything but casual weekend warriors. Marcus's heart sank as he recognized the tactical approach. These men knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find. "Get behind the truck," Marcus whispered urgently to Sarah, but she was already moving, gathering her medical supplies while keeping the warming cub pressed against her chest. Bella rose to her full height, positioning herself between the approaching threat and the humans who had saved her baby. The sight of a 400-pound brown bear in full protective mode would have terrified most people, but these hunters seemed more annoyed than afraid. The lead snowmobile pulled to a stop 50 yards away, and Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis. The man who removed his helmet and stepped into the snow was someone he'd known for 23 years, someone he'd trusted with his life in the depths of the earth, someone who'd stood beside him at Danny's funeral and promised to always be there. Jake Morrison looked older than his 62 years, his once sandy hair now steel gray, and his face carved with lines that spoke of obsession rather than wisdom. His pale blue eyes, which had once sparkled with the easy humor of a mining buddy, now held the cold calculation of a predator. The hunting rifle slung across his shoulder was military grade, designed for killing at distance. "Marcus," Jake's voice carried across the clearing with a familiarity that felt like a betrayal. "Should have known you'd stick your nose into business that ain't yours. Some things never change." "Jake." Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself between his old friend and the makeshift family behind him. "What the hell are you doing out here? And don't tell me you're hunting legally, because I know what that pit is for." Jake's 2 companions flanked him with practiced precision, hired muscle with dead eyes and expensive equipment. They looked like the kind of men who'd learned their trade in places where life was cheap and questions were dangerous. The kind of men who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. "You remember Emma, don't you, Marcus?" Jake's voice carried a tremor that spoke of barely controlled rage. My little girl, sweet 16, just got her driver's license, whole life ahead of her. His hand tightened on his rifle. Until one of those things ripped her apart on a camping trip 5 years ago. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Jake's daughter Emma had died in a tragic accident, but the official report had mentioned drowning, not a bear attack. Something was wrong with this story, but the grief and fury radiating from his old friend were absolutely real. Jake, the report said Emma drowned. There was never any mention of reports lie. Jake's shout echoed off the canyon walls, causing Bella to growl low in her throat. They covered it up to protect the tourist industry. But I know what I saw when I found her body. Claw marks, bite wounds. That thing turned my baby girl into hamburger, and the whole damn system protected the bears instead of protecting families like mine. Sarah emerged from behind the truck, the recovering cub still pressed against her chest. Her veterinarian's training had kicked in fully. The animal's welfare superseded her own safety. The cub needs constant warmth, she said firmly. Whatever this is about, that baby bear did nothing wrong. One of Jake's hired guns raised his weapon, but Jake waved him off. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, right? The bleeding heart who runs that sanctuary for killer animals. You're part of the problem, lady. Teaching people that these monsters are somehow noble or misunderstood. They're not monsters, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the gun pointed in her direction. They're mothers protecting their children, just like any human would do. Jake's laugh was bitter as winter wind. My Emma was protecting herself when that bear found her campsite. Fat lot of good it did her. He turned back to Marcus. You cost me a lot of money today, old friend. That cub and its mother were going to fund my operation for the next 6 months. Bear gallbladders fetch $50,000 each in the right markets, and Mama Bear there is carrying enough prime organs to buy some serious equipment. The casual way Jake discussed harvesting Bella's organs made Marcus's stomach turn. This wasn't the man who'd pulled him from a collapsed mine shaft 15 years ago or held his hand during Danny's funeral. This was someone consumed by grief until it had transformed into something monstrous. You're talking about a mother and her baby, Jake. Remember when you taught me to track deer? You said we only take what we need, and we never touch the mothers or the young. That was before one of them took everything from me. Jake's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. I've spent 5 years perfecting these traps, Marcus. Portable pit systems that can be assembled in any terrain. I've got 12 active sites across 3 states, and business is booming. The scope of the operation hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't isolated poaching, it was systematic slaughter on an industrial scale. Jake had turned his mining expertise and wilderness knowledge into a machine for destroying everything Marcus had spent his later years trying to protect. Those engine sounds we heard earlier, Sarah said quietly. There are more of them out there. Jake nodded. My boys are checking the other sites. We've got a shipping deadline to meet. Asian markets pay premium for fresh organs, but the merchandise has to be properly harvested and preserved. He gestured toward his companions. These gentlemen are specialists in rapid field processing. The cub stirred in Sarah's arms, making a small sound that was part whimper, part purr. The noise seemed to break something in Bella, who had been standing statue still throughout the confrontation. The massive bear took a step forward, her message clear: threaten her baby and face the consequences. Easy there, Mama, one of the gunmen said, raising his rifle. We can do this the hard way, if you prefer. No. Marcus stepped directly into the line of fire. Jake, you want to blame something for Emma's death, blame me. I'm the one who relocated that mother bear 8 years ago instead of having her destroyed. I'm the one who taught her that humans could be trusted. If there's blood on anyone's hands, it's mine. The admission hung in the frigid air like a death sentence. Marcus could see the calculation in Jake's eyes, weighing 23 years of friendship against 5 years of grief-fueled rage. Behind him, he could hear Sarah whispering comfort to the cub, and Bella's steady breathing as she waited for violence to explode. "You know what the funny thing is?" Jake's voice had gone flat and emotionless. "I came out here planning to put that bear down quick and clean. Professional harvest, no suffering. But now that I know you're personally responsible for my daughter's death, I think I'll make sure you watch Mama Bear die slow." The standoff stretched like a guitar string about to snap. 3 professional killers with military-grade weapons, an unarmed park ranger, a veterinarian with a baby bear, and a mother who would die before letting anyone harm her child. The mathematics of survival weren't complicated, but sometimes the numbers didn't account for the human heart. Marcus felt Danny's presence beside him as clearly as if his son were standing in the snow, not as a ghost or a vision, but as a voice in his memory saying the words that had defined his short life. "Dad, sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice that matters." "Jake," Marcus said quietly, "Emma wouldn't want this. You know she wouldn't. That little girl who cried when you brought home a dead deer, who made you promise to only hunt what the family needed for food. Would she really want her death to be used as an excuse for this kind of slaughter?" For just a moment, something human flickered in Jake's eyes. A memory of a 16-year-old girl who'd lectured her father about conservation and made him donate to wildlife charities instead of buying her a car for her birthday. Then the moment passed, and the predator returned. "Emma's dead because of choices you made," Jake said, raising his rifle. "Time for you to live with the consequences." The sound of the safety clicking off seemed unnaturally loud in the mountain silence. Bella's growl deepened to a rumble that Marcus could feel in his chest. Sarah pressed the cub closer to her body, whispering what sounded like a prayer. And Marcus Thomas Thompson, 65 years old and tired of running from guilt, stepped forward instead of back. "Then pull the trigger, old friend. But you better make sure you kill me with the first shot, because if you don't, that bear is going to tear you apart, and there won't be enough left of you to bury." The shot that shattered the mountain silence didn't come from Jake's rifle. It came from somewhere in the trees behind them, a sharp crack that sent snow cascading from the pine branches and caused all 6 humans to freeze in confusion. Bella's head snapped toward the sound, her ears pricked forward as she scented the wind for new threats. "What the hell?" one of Jake's hired guns began, but his words were cut off by another shot, this one closer. Someone else was in these woods, someone with a high-powered rifle and the skill to use it. Marcus felt a wild surge of hope. Park Service backup, maybe, or Fish and Wildlife officers responding to a poaching report. But that hope died as quickly as it had been born when 3 figures emerged from the tree line, more hunters dressed in the same military-style winter gear as Jake's companions. The trap had been even larger than Marcus had realized. "About time you boys showed up," Jake called out, never taking his rifle off Marcus. "Had a little complication here, but nothing we can't handle." The lead newcomer pulled off his tactical face mask, revealing a weathered face that spoke of too many years in too many wars. "Got your radio signal about witnesses. How do you want to handle this?" The casual way they discussed murder made Sarah clutch the cub tighter against her chest. The small creature had finally stopped shivering as her body heat and the chemical warming pads brought its core temperature back to safe levels, but now all their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. "Marcus here is an old friend," Jake said, his voice taking on the tone of a man savoring revenge. "He's personally responsible for my daughter's death, so I think he deserves special treatment." The woman, well, she's seen too much to let walk away. Bella seemed to understand that the threat had multiplied. The massive bear began moving in a slow circle around Sarah and the cub, her massive frame creating a living barrier. Her behavior was unlike anything Marcus had seen in 4 decades of wildlife observation. A wild animal consciously protecting humans, making tactical decisions that demonstrated intelligence beyond mere instinct. "That's a big bear," the newcomer observed, raising his own rifle, "probably worth 70,000 on the Asian market. Shame to waste good merchandise on revenge." "My operation, my rules," Jake snapped. "The bear dies last after it watches me settle some old debts. Sometimes money isn't the only payment that matters." The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the clearing and reducing visibility to mere yards. Marcus realized this might be their only chance. If they could somehow break free from this kill zone, the storm might provide enough cover to reach Sarah's truck. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but the alternative was standing here waiting to die. That's when the impossible happened. The cub in Sarah's arms began making a sound Marcus had never heard before, not the typical whimpering of a frightened baby bear, but something that carried across the clearing like a distress call. And from somewhere in the swirling snow came an answer. Bella's mate. A massive male brown bear, easily 600 pounds, materialized from the storm like a force of nature. His dark fur was rimmed with ice, and his small eyes held the kind of focused rage that could only come from a father whose family was threatened. The sight of him caused even the professional killers to step backward. "Jesus Christ," one of the gunmen whispered. "Where the hell did that come from?" Male brown bears were notoriously territorial and aggressive, especially during winter when food was scarce. This one had probably been hunting miles away when his mate's distress calls reached him, and now he stood like a mountain of muscle and fury, assessing the threat to his family. Jake's tactical situation had just become exponentially more complicated. 6 humans with rifles against 2 fully grown brown bears in their natural habitat with limited visibility and worsening weather conditions. The smart play would have been to retreat and return with better preparation, but grief and obsession had long since eroded Jake's capacity for rational decision-making. "Take them both," Jake ordered. "Headshots only. I want the organs intact for processing." The clearing erupted into chaos. 6 rifles opened fire simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting the swirling snow like deadly fireworks. But shooting accurately at moving bears in blizzard conditions proved nearly impossible, and brown bears could cover ground faster than most people could run. The male charged the nearest group of hunters with a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. At 600 pounds, moving at 30 miles per hour, he was essentially an unstoppable force of nature. The first gunman got off 2 shots before those massive paws reached him, and then he simply disappeared under an avalanche of muscle and rage. Bella moved with different tactics, maternal protection rather than male aggression. She positioned herself directly over Sarah and the cub, her massive body creating a dome of protection while she swatted at anyone who came too close. Her claws, designed for digging through frozen ground, turned tactical gear into ribbons and sent grown men flying like children's toys. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of being protected by the same animals Jake was trying to slaughter. As bullets whined past his head, he crawled toward Sarah's truck, dragging her along while she refused to release the cub. Behind them, Bella maintained her defensive position, taking hits that would have dropped most creatures but somehow staying on her feet through pure maternal determination. "The truck!" Marcus shouted over the gunfire and animal roars. "We need to reach the truck!" But even as they scrambled across the bloody snow, Marcus knew they weren't going to make it. Too much open ground, too many shooters, and too many variables that could go wrong in the space of 50 yards. One lucky shot, one moment of confusion, and this rescue attempt would end the same way Danny's had, with people Marcus cared about dying while he watched helplessly. That's when Jake made his mistake. Obsessed with revenge against the man he blamed for his daughter's death, he left his protected position among the trees and moved into the open, trying to get a clear shot at Marcus. It was the kind of tactical error that professional soldiers learned not to make, but grief had overruled training. The male bear, having dealt with his immediate threats, spotted this new target. 600 pounds of apex predator focused its attention on the man who smelled of gun oil and death, and Jake Morrison suddenly found himself face to face with the kind of force that his traps and rifles had been designed to avoid. "Jake, run!" Marcus shouted, despite everything that had happened between them. 23 years of friendship couldn't be erased by 5 years of madness, and he couldn't watch his old mining partner get mauled to death, even if that partner was currently trying to kill him. But Jake had spent too many years hunting these animals to simply run. He raised his rifle for what he clearly intended as a killing shot, aiming for the bear's brain at point-blank range. It should have been an easy kill, no wind, no distance, no movement to account for. The rifle clicked empty. In all the chaos and shooting, Jake had lost count of his ammunition. The most experienced hunter in the clearing was suddenly facing an enraged 600-pound bear with nothing but an empty weapon and 5 years of accumulated rage. Time seemed to slow as the massive male reared up on his hind legs, towering 9 feet above the man who had killed so many of his kind. Jake's face showed no fear, only a kind of grim satisfaction, as if this confrontation was exactly what he'd been seeking all along. "Emma," Jake whispered. And Marcus wasn't sure if it was a prayer, an apology, or simply the last word of a broken man. The bear's massive paws came down like twin hammers, and Jake Morrison disappeared into the trampled snow of the clearing. When the male bear stepped back, breathing heavily and scanning for additional threats, what remained barely looked human. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, not his body, but his heart. Despite everything Jake had become, despite the evil he'd committed and planned to commit, he'd once been the man who'd saved Marcus's life in a collapsed mine. He'd been Danny's honorary uncle, Martha's friend, a man who'd laughed at birthday parties and cried at funerals and tried to do right by the world until grief had twisted him into something unrecognizable. The silence that followed Jake's death was more terrible than all the gunfire that had preceded it. The surviving hunters, those who could still move, had scattered into the storm like roaches when the lights came on, abandoning their expensive equipment and their dead companions in their desperate flight from the 2 bears who had turned their coordinated kill zone into a slaughterhouse. Marcus knelt in the blood-stained snow beside what remained of his oldest friend, his weathered hands shaking as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Jake Morrison, who had once shared his lunch every day in the mines, who had stood as best man at his wedding, who had carried Danny's coffin at the funeral, reduced to torn fabric and broken bones by the very animals he'd spent 5 years trying to exterminate. The irony was as bitter as the Montana wind. Jake had become what he'd hunted, trapped by his own obsession in a pit of rage and grief that he'd dug one shovelful of hatred at a time. And just like the animals he'd snared, there had been no escape once the walls closed in around him. "Marcus," Sarah's voice cut through his grief, sharp with medical urgency. "Marcus, I need you to focus. The cub is going into shock." He forced himself to turn away from Jake's body and focus on the living. The baby bear in Sarah's arms was convulsing, its small body overwhelmed by the stress of the rescue, the gunfight, and the sudden temperature changes. All their work to save its life would be meaningless if they lost it now to trauma-induced cardiac arrest. "What do you need?" Marcus asked, his ranger training overriding personal grief the way it had been designed to do. "Warmth, quiet, and my full medical kit back at the clinic," Sarah replied, already moving toward her truck. "And we need to get there fast. This little one's system can't take much more." The two adult bears watched their hurried movements with an intensity that made Marcus's skin crawl. The massive male stood over Jake's body like a sentinel, his dark eyes tracking every human motion, while Bella positioned herself between her family and the scattered weapons of the dead hunters. They were no longer the desperate, trapped animals from an hour ago. They were apex predators who had just proven their dominance over the humans who dared to threaten their cub. "Will they follow us?" Sarah asked, keying the truck's ignition with hands that shook despite her professional training. Marcus studied the bear's body language as he climbed into the passenger seat. Bella was focused entirely on her cub, making soft sounds that seemed designed to comfort the baby even from a distance. The male was more aggressive, but his attention was directed outward, scanning the tree line for additional threats rather than viewing the humans as enemies. "I don't think so," Marcus said. "They got what they wanted. Their cub is safe and the threat is eliminated." Bears aren't vindictive like humans. They kill when they have to, then move on. The drive to Sarah's veterinary clinic was a nightmare of icy roads and white-knuckle turns made worse by the cargo in Sarah's arms and the emotional weight of what they'd witnessed. The cub's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and its small body felt ominously limp despite the warming blankets wrapped around it. "Tell me about Jake," Sarah said quietly as they navigated a particularly treacherous switchback. "Before he became what he became." Marcus stared out at the snow-covered landscape, trying to reconcile the man who'd just died with the friend he'd once known. He was good people, once upon a time. Generous to a fault, couldn't stand to see anything suffer. Used to rescue injured birds and bring them to his daughter Emma to nurse back to health. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Emma Morrison, 16 years old with her father's blue eyes and her mother's gentle smile, had been planning to become a veterinarian. She'd spent her summers volunteering at wildlife rehabilitation centers and her school years campaigning for stronger environmental protection laws. She would have hated what he did today, Marcus continued. Emma loved bears, had a whole collection of stuffed ones, posters on her bedroom walls, donated her allowance to bear conservation groups. If she could have seen what her father became. "What really happened to her?" Sarah asked. Because that story about a bear attack didn't ring true. Marcus was quiet for a long time, piecing together memories and half-heard conversations from 5 years ago. Emma drowned at Pine Lake during a camping trip. Jake had been drinking, more than usual, which was already too much. She went for a swim while he was passed out in his tent, got caught in an undertow, and never made it back to shore. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Jake had woken up to find his daughter's body washed up on the beach, and in his grief and guilt, he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid facing his own responsibility for her death. The bear attack story had probably started as a drunken delusion and gradually hardened into a reality he'd convinced himself to believe. He couldn't live with the truth, Marcus realized aloud. So he created a version where he was the grieving father instead of the negligent drunk. 5 years of hunting bears because it was easier than hunting his own demons. Sarah navigated the final turn into her clinic's parking lot, her small facility looking like a beacon of hope in the storm. The building was modest but well-equipped, designed for treating everything from household pets to injured wildlife. Inside, she had the medical equipment necessary to save the cub's life if they weren't already too late. "Help me get this little one inside," Sarah said, gathering the cub carefully in her arms. "And Marcus, whatever Jake became at the end, the man who was your friend for 23 years wouldn't want you carrying guilt for his choices." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and tense waiting. Sarah worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, using every technique she'd learned in 30 years of veterinary medicine to stabilize the cub's vital signs and treat its hypothermia. Marcus found himself relegated to the role of assistant, following Sarah's crisp instructions while trying not to think about the carnage they'd left behind in the mountains. The cub, Sarah had started calling him Bandit because of the distinctive markings around his eyes, responded slowly but steadily to treatment. His core temperature gradually returned to normal ranges, his breathing became less labored, and by late afternoon he was taking small amounts of warm milk formula from a bottle. "He's going to make it," Sarah announced, sagging against the examination table with exhaustion. "Full recovery, no permanent damage from the hypothermia. In a few weeks he'll be strong enough to rejoin his mother." Marcus felt tears he hadn't known he was holding back spill down his cheeks. After losing Danny, after watching Martha fade away from grief, after seeing Jake transform into a monster and die violently, they had actually managed to save something. One small life preserved against all odds, one family reunited when so many others had been destroyed. "What happens now?" he asked. "With the investigation, the dead bodies, all the questions that are going to get asked?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, stroking Bandit's fur while the cub slept peacefully under warm blankets. "The truth," she said finally. "Jake Morrison was running an illegal poaching operation that resulted in multiple deaths when he and his associates attacked park rangers performing a wildlife rescue. The bears were defending their territory and their young, which is natural behavior that any court will understand." It was the truth, Marcus realized. Not the whole truth. That would require explaining about Jake's delusions and the complicated history between two old friends, but enough truth to satisfy investigators and protect the bears who had simply been acting like bears. Outside the clinic windows, snow continued to fall on the Montana wilderness, where Bella and her mate were probably already searching for their missing cub. Tomorrow, if Bandit continued his recovery, they would arrange a reunion that would restore a family that had come within minutes of being destroyed forever. For the first time in 10 years, Marcus Thomas Thompson felt like he'd done something that mattered. And something Danny would have been proud of. Something that proved an old man could still make a difference in a world that seemed determined to break apart everything beautiful and wild. 3 days later, while Bandit slept peacefully in a heated recovery kennel at Sarah's clinic, Marcus found himself standing in Jake Morrison's abandoned hunting camp, staring at evidence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The FBI Wildlife Crime Unit had asked him to guide them through the scattered equipment and documentation, using his knowledge of both Jake's personality and wilderness survival to help piece together the scope of the illegal operation. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Jake's camp contained detailed maps marking 12 active trap sites across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Shipping manifests showed regular deliveries to black market dealers in San Francisco and Seattle, who then exported the bear organs to Asian markets where they fetched astronomical prices. Financial records indicated that Jake's operation had generated over $2 million in the past 3 years alone. But it was the personal items that broke Marcus's heart. A framed photograph of 16-year-old Emma Morrison sat on Jake's makeshift desk, surrounded by newspaper clippings about bear attacks that had nothing to do with her actual death. Jake had collected stories of bear maulings from across North America, creating a distorted reality where his daughter's drowning became part of a larger pattern of ursine violence that existed only in his grief-addled mind. The most damning evidence was Jake's personal journal, 5 years of deteriorating handwriting that chronicled his descent from grieving father to obsessed killer. The early entries spoke of legitimate pain, a man struggling to understand how he'd failed his daughter, how his drinking had cost him the most precious thing in his life. But as months turned to years, the entries became increasingly divorced from reality. Day 847 found evidence of bear activity near Pine Lake. They're mocking me, coming back to the scene of their crime. Emma's spirit won't rest until I eliminate every last one of them. Day 1203. The government is protecting them. Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, even the local sheriff's department. They're all part of the cover-up. Emma's death was just collateral damage in their precious conservation agenda. Day 147. Marcus called again today. Wants to talk about getting help and moving forward. He doesn't understand that moving forward means finishing what Emma started when she fought back against that monster. Every dead bear is a victory for her memory. FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, a severe woman in her 40s who specialized in wildlife crimes, looked up from the journal with disgust. This man was completely detached from reality. According to the official reports I've reviewed, his daughter drowned while he was passed out drunk. There was never any bear involvement whatsoever. Marcus nodded grimly. Jake couldn't live with being responsible for Emma's death, so he created a fantasy where he was the hero instead of the negligent father. 5 years of killing innocent animals because facing the truth was too painful. The psychological profile fits, Agent Walsh confirmed. Guilt-driven delusional disorder combined with substance abuse and social isolation. The bear hunting gave him a sense of purpose and control that his real life lacked. Unfortunately, it also made him extremely dangerous. They continued cataloging evidence as the day wore on, building a case that would help prosecute any surviving members of Jake's network. But Marcus found his attention drifting to a small wooden box tucked beneath Jake's cot. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper like precious relics, were items that told the real story of Jake Morrison's life. A child's drawing, signed Emma, age 7, showing a stick figure, man and girl holding hands beside a lake full of fish. A Father's Day card written in careful cursive. Dear Daddy, thank you for teaching me to love animals and nature. You're the best dad in the whole world. A photograph of Jake and Emma at Yellowstone National Park, both wearing binoculars and matching smiles as they watched a family of bears from a safe distance. She really did love bears, Marcus whispered, holding up the Yellowstone photo. Look at her face. That's pure joy, not fear. Agent Walsh examined the photograph with professional interest. This actually supports our psychological assessment. Morrison wasn't just killing bears, he was killing the parts of his daughter that would have disapproved of his actions. Classic projection of self-hatred onto external targets. The revelation that Emma had been a bear enthusiast added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. Jake hadn't just betrayed his friend and violated his principles, he'd betrayed his daughter's memory and everything she'd stood for. The very animals he'd spent 5 years slaughtering were creatures she'd dedicated her young life to protecting. Marcus carefully placed Emma's artwork back in the wooden box, feeling the weight of multiple griefs settling on his shoulders. He was mourning not just the friend Jake had become, but the friend Jake had been, and the bright young woman whose death had set this whole tragedy in motion. There's something else you need to see, Agent Walsh said, leading him to a laptop computer that had been hidden beneath a tarp. Morrison was documenting his kills with video footage. Fair warning, it's not easy to watch. The videos were professionally shot and edited, showing Jake's transformation from amateur poacher to systematic killer. The early footage showed him hesitant and emotional, struggling with what he was doing, even as he convinced himself it was necessary. But as the months progressed, the videos revealed a man becoming increasingly cold and methodical in his approach to ending life. What disturbed Marcus most wasn't the killing itself, though that was horrible enough, but Jake's growing detachment from the reality of what he was doing. In later videos, he spoke about the bears as if they were abstract problems to be solved rather than living creatures with their own families and purposes. Subject 17, adult female, estimated weight 300 pounds. Trap activation successful at 0600 hours. Processing completed by ASIO 800. Gallbladder and paws harvested for shipment. Note: cubs observed in area will set secondary traps for next sweep. The clinical language couldn't disguise what Marcus was really hearing, the voice of a man who had lost his humanity one dead animal at a time. Jake had started his crusade believing he was protecting other families from experiencing his loss, but somewhere along the way he'd stopped seeing bears as individuals and started seeing them as commodity units to be harvested. "How many?" Marcus asked quietly. "How many bears did he kill?" Agent Walsh consulted her notes. "Based on shipping records and video documentation, we estimate 47 individual animals over 5 years, mostly adult females and cubs, which is consistent with the trap design. He was systematically targeting mothers with young, probably because they were easier to predict and brought higher prices. 47 bears. 47 Bellas and bandits who had died because one man couldn't face the truth about his own failures." Marcus thought about the trust he'd seen in Bella's eyes when she'd allowed him to save her cub, and he wondered how many other mother bears had died still hoping that the strange creatures with tools and weapons might somehow help instead of hurt. "There's one more thing," Agent Walsh said, her professional composure cracking slightly. "The video from 3 days ago when you and Dr. Mitchell interrupted his operation. He was planning to film your deaths as well, probably as some kind of trophy or proof of his dedication to Emma's memory." The revelation that Jake had intended to document murdering his oldest friend added a final layer of horror to an already unthinkable betrayal. Marcus realized that the man who'd once saved his life in a collapsed mine had been planning to end it in front of a camera, turning their friendship into just another scene in his delusional revenge fantasy. But even with all the evidence of Jake's crimes spread out before him, Marcus found himself thinking about the wooden box full of Emma's childhood treasures. The man who'd saved those drawings and photographs wasn't entirely gone, even at the end. Some part of Jake Morrison had remained connected to his daughter's true legacy, even while destroying everything she'd believed in. "Agent Walsh," Marcus said slowly, "I want to make sure that box of Emma's things gets returned to her grandmother. And I want the media to know who Emma really was. Not the victim in her father's fantasy, but the conservation-minded young woman who would have been heartbroken by what he did in her name." Agent Walsh nodded. "We can arrange that. The family deserves to have her real story told, not the distorted version Morrison created." As they finished cataloging evidence and prepared to leave Jake's camp forever, Marcus took one last look around the place where his oldest friend had spent 5 years descending into madness. The expensive equipment, the detailed maps, the clinical documentation of systematic slaughter, all of it would be evidence in court cases and academic studies for years to come. But what would stay with Marcus wasn't the evidence of Jake's crimes. It was the memory of Emma Morrison's artwork, showing a little girl who'd believed her father could teach her to love the natural world. She'd trusted him with her wonder and curiosity, and he'd carried that trust for 24 years before grief and guilt finally corrupted it into something unrecognizable. The tragedy wasn't just that Jake Morrison had become a killer. It was that he'd forgotten who Emma Morrison had really been. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Marcus Thompson stood in his best suit on the deck of Sarah Mitchell's wildlife sanctuary, watching the woman he'd fallen in love with walk down an aisle lined with wildflowers and wildlife experts who'd become their extended family. At 66, he'd never imagined he'd be getting married again, but grief had taught him that life was too precious to waste on artificial timelines and other people's expectations about what old folks should or shouldn't do. Sarah looked radiant, in a simple cream-colored dress that complemented her silver-streaked hair, which she'd finally let grow out after decades of keeping it short for practical veterinary work. Her smile held all the warmth and promise that had first drawn him to her during those terrible hours when they'd fought to save a baby bear's life. not knowing they were also saving their own chances at happiness. The ceremony was small and perfect, just 20 guests who mattered, including FBI agent Walsh, who'd become an unlikely friend during the investigation, and Emma Morrison's grandmother, who'd made the trip from Billings to honor the memory of her granddaughter by witnessing a love story that had grown from tragedy into hope. But the most unusual wedding guests were positioned at the edge of the cleared sanctuary grounds, watching from the safety of the tree line. Bella and her mate had established a territory that included Sarah's clinic, and over the past months they'd become regular visitors, bringing their cubs to graze in the meadows while keeping a respectful distance from human activity. Today, as if sensing the significance of the occasion, the entire Bear family had emerged to observe the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," began Pastor Williams, a soft-spoken man who'd agreed to perform an outdoor ceremony despite his obvious nervousness about the proximity of wild bears, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus and Sarah, two souls who found each other in the winter of their lives and proved that love has no expiration date." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as the pastor spoke about second chances and unexpected blessings. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely old man counting down his remaining years, convinced that his best days were behind him. Now he was holding hands with a woman who'd helped him rediscover purpose and joy, preparing to begin the next chapter of a story he'd thought was nearly finished. "Sarah?" Marcus said when it came time for vows, his voice surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "You taught me that saving something precious is always worth the risk. You showed me that a 66-year-old heart can still learn to hope again. I promise to spend whatever years God gives us protecting the things we both love, each other, the animals in our care, and the wild places that need our voices." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she spoke her own vows. "Marcus, you proved to me that heroes come in all ages, and that the bravest thing a person can do is choose love over fear, even when the odds seem impossible. I promise to be your partner in all things, in adventure and in quiet moments, in the work that matters and in the rest we've both earned." The exchange of rings was interrupted by a sound that made everyone turn toward the forest. Bandit, now 6 months old and fully recovered from his ordeal, had broken away from his family and was approaching the wedding party with the confident swagger of a young bear who'd learned that these particular humans meant safety rather than threat. "Well," Pastor Williams said with a nervous laugh, "I don't believe I've ever had a ring bearer quite like this one." Bandit stopped about 20 feet from the gathered humans, close enough to see clearly, but far enough to retreat quickly if needed. He sat on his haunches and watched the proceedings with obvious interest, occasionally looking back toward his parents as if reporting on the strange human ritual taking place in his territory. "I think he's giving his approval," Sarah whispered, squeezing Marcus's hand. "Either that or he's hoping someone drops wedding cake," Marcus replied, making Sarah laugh despite the tears streaming down her face. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from their human guests were echoed by a low rumble from the forest, Bella's distinctive vocalization that they'd both learned to recognize over the months of careful interaction. It was the sound she made when her cubs accomplished something that pleased her, and hearing it during their wedding ceremony felt like a blessing from the natural world they'd dedicated their lives to protecting. The reception was held in Sarah's renovated barn, transformed for the occasion with string lights and tables made from reclaimed wood. The menu featured locally sourced ingredients and Emma Morrison's favorite chocolate cake recipe, provided by her grandmother as a way of honoring the young woman whose death had set these events in motion. "You know," said Agent Walsh, raising a glass of local wine during the toasts, "in 30 years of investigating wildlife crimes, I've never seen a case that ended with a wedding and a bear family adopting the witnesses, Marcus and Sarah, You've restored my faith in the possibility that good can triumph over evil, even when the evil comes from people we thought we knew." The toast that followed was interrupted by Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the wildlife biologist who'd been studying Bella's family as part of a broader research project on human-bear interactions. "I have some news that I think you'll want to hear," she announced, pulling out a tablet computer loaded with camera trap footage. The video showed Bella and her mate in a meadow about 2 miles from the sanctuary, but they weren't alone. 3 cubs played in the grass around them, Bandit and 2 smaller bears that appeared to be only a few weeks old. "Twins," Dr. Chen explained with obvious excitement. "Born about a month ago, which means Bella was pregnant during the rescue operation. The stress of that day could have caused her to lose the pregnancy, but instead she successfully raised 3 healthy cubs while maintaining a territory that overlaps with human activity. It's unprecedented behavior that's changing how we understand bear adaptability." Marcus stared at the footage with wonder. Bella had not only survived the trauma of nearly losing Bandit, but had gone on to expand her family while maintaining the unusual trust relationship she'd developed with the humans who'd saved her cub. The implications for wildlife management and conservation were staggering. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "Bella's behavior has influenced other bear families in the region. We're documenting increased tolerance for human presence among bears whose territories border the sanctuary. It's as if she's teaching them that not all humans are threats." Sarah wiped away fresh tears as she watched the footage of Bella's twins wrestling with their older brother. "She's building a legacy," Sarah said softly. "Teaching her children and her community that cooperation is possible." As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Marcus and Sarah found themselves alone on the deck, watching the stars emerge over the Montana wilderness. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of bears moving through the forest, not threatening sounds, but the comfortable noises of a family settling down for the night in territory they considered safe. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Sarah asked, leaning against Marcus's shoulder as they shared a blanket in the cooling air. "Interfering with nature, risking our own lives, changing the natural order of things?" Marcus considered the question carefully, thinking about all the factors that had led them to this moment. Jake's descent into madness, Emma's tragic death, Bella's desperate cries for help, and the split-second decisions that had saved a baby bear's life while ending a human friendship that had lasted 23 years. "I think," he said finally, "that we did what love required us to do. Not romantic love, though that came later, but the kind of love that recognizes suffering and refuses to turn away, even when helping is complicated and dangerous." "Jake loved Emma," Sarah pointed out, "but his love became twisted into something destructive." "The difference," Marcus replied, "is that Jake's love was about possession and control. He wanted to reshape the world to match his vision of what Emma deserved, even if that meant destroying the things she actually cared about. Our love, for each other, for Bella's family, for the wild places that sustain us all, is about protection and nurturing, not domination." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching shooting stars trace silver paths across the dark sky, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a man haunted by failures and losses, counting down his remaining days in isolation and regret. Tonight, he was married to a woman who understood his calling, surrounded by evidence that their actions had created positive change that would ripple through generations of both human and bear families. "Thank you," he whispered to Sarah as they prepared to go inside. "For what?" "For showing me that 66 isn't too old to become a better man." Sarah kissed him softly as the sounds of the wilderness settled around them like a benediction. "Thank you for proving that love really can save the day, even when the day seems lost." In the forest beyond the sanctuary, Bella settled down with her 3 cubs, secure in territory that had become a bridge between the human and natural worlds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for understanding, but tonight there was only peace and the knowledge that sometimes, when people choose courage over fear and love over hatred, the whole world becomes a little bit safer for families of every species. At 65, Marcus Thompson thought his story was ending. Widowed, alone, convinced his best years were behind him. But sometimes life has other plans. When he heard a mother bear's desperate cries echoing through the Montana wilderness, he made a choice that changed everything. He chose to act instead of walking away. He chose compassion over protocol. He chose to believe that an old man could still make a difference. That single moment of courage didn't just save a bear family. It led him to Sarah, a woman who understood that love doesn't have an expiration date. And together, they discovered that the most beautiful chapters of life can be written in what others call the twilight years. Marcus learned that retirement isn't about winding down. It's about finding new purposes that matter. At 66, he wasn't too old to fall in love, start fresh, or become the hero of his own story. His weathered hands that once felt useless became the instruments of rescue and renewal. If you're wondering whether it's too late to change your story, remember Marcus. Remember that every sunrise offers a chance to choose hope over resignation, connection over isolation, and purpose over just passing time. What moment in your life made you realize you still had more to give? Have you ever felt too old to start something new? And what would you say to someone feeling that way today?